The dust settled on the main street of Redemption Creek as Lillian Cooper clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, painfully aware of the jeering stares directed at her torn shoes. She hadn't meant to become a spectacle in the bustling Wyoming town, but the long journey from Missouri had taken its toll on her only pair of footwear, leaving them split at the seams with the soles nearly separated. It was 1878, 3 years since her husband Daniel had succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving her with nothing but debts and broken promises. At 27, Lillian never imagined she'd be standing alone in a strange town, the object of cruel amusement as she made her way toward the general store. "Would you look at that?" a woman whispered loudly enough for Lillian to hear. "Another desperate widow come to find herself a husband, I reckon. Can't even afford proper shoes." Lillian kept her gaze fixed ahead, willing herself not to show the humiliation burning in her chest. The last of her money was earmarked for supplies, not footwear, no matter how desperately she needed it. She'd walked hundreds of miles in those shoes, and they'd have to last until she found work and lodging in this town. As she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her heel caught in a gap between the planks. The sole of her right shoe finally gave way, tearing completely from the upper. Lillian stumbled, nearly falling face first onto the rough boards as laughter erupted around her. "Careful there, madam." A deep voice cut through the humiliating chorus of chuckles. Strong hands steadied her, and Lillian looked up into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and a neatly trimmed beard the color of wheat. His clothes were dusty but well-kept dark trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a worn leather vest. The silver star pinned to his chest gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Thank you," she managed, trying to gather what remained of her dignity. "Name's Thomas Zachary," he said, tipping his hat. "Town Marshal of Redemption Creek." His eyes flicked down to her ruined footwear, but unlike the others, there was no mockery in his gaze, only concern. "Lillian Cooper," she replied, attempting to pull away, only to realize she couldn't walk properly with one shoe practically disintegrated. The marshal frowned at the small crowd that had gathered. "Don't you folks have somewhere to be?" His voice wasn't raised, but it carried authority that sent the onlookers scattering. Lillian felt tears threatening. She blinked them back fiercely. "I appreciate your help, Marshal, but I'll be fine." "Those shoes say otherwise, Mrs. Cooper." There was a gentleness in his voice that nearly broke her composure. "McAllister's store is just down the way. Let me assist you." Before she could protest, Marshal Zachary offered his arm. With little choice, Lillian accepted, painfully aware of her shoe flapping with each step and the curious stares from townsfolk going about their business. "New in town?" he asked conversationally as they made slow progress. "Arrived on the stage this morning," Lillian confirmed. "I'm hoping to find work." "What kind of work are you looking for?" Lillian hesitated. "I was a schoolteacher before I married, but I can cook, clean, sew whatever's needed." They reached McAllister's General Store, a large establishment with a wide porch and windows displaying everything from tools to fabric. Marshal Zachary helped her up the steps and opened the door, a small bell announcing their arrival. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and spices. An older man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from behind the counter. "Afternoon, Marshal," he called. "What brings you in today?" "Mrs. Cooper here needs some assistance, George," Thomas replied, guiding Lillian forward. "She's new to Redemption Creek." George McAllister's eyes traveled down to Lillian's shoes, and she braced herself for more ridicule. Instead, his expression softened with understanding. "Been on the road a while, I reckon," he said kindly. "Those shoes have seen better days." "I'm afraid I don't have much to spend on footwear just now," Lillian admitted, hating how vulnerable the words made her feel. Before McAllister could respond, Marshal Zachary spoke up. "Show Mrs. Cooper your selection of ladies' boots, George. The practical kind, sturdy enough for Wyoming weather." "Marshal, that's not necessary," Lillian started to protest. "Everyone needs good boots in these parts," he interrupted gently. "Consider it a welcome to Redemption Creek." McAllister led them to a section where several pairs of women's boots were displayed. These cowhide ones are popular with the ladies who do more than just promenade down Main Street, he said, holding up a handsome pair of brown leather boots with modest heels. They're lovely, Lillian said softly, but I couldn't possibly try them on, Thomas insisted. If they don't fit, we'll find something that does. Feeling both mortified and grateful, Lillian sat on a nearby chair and removed what remained of her old shoes. Her stockings were darned in multiple places, and she felt a flush of embarrassment knowing the marshal could see this evidence of her poverty. George McAllister brought over the boots in her size, and Lillian slipped them on. They fit perfectly, the leather supple yet sturdy with room for thick socks in winter. How do they feel? Thomas asked. Wonderful, Lillian admitted, standing to test them. After months of discomfort, the proper support felt miraculous. But I can't allow you to consider it done, the marshal said firmly, handing McAllister some coins. George, add a pair of wool stockings to that. Lillian watched helplessly as the transaction was completed, her pride warred with necessity and gratitude. When McAllister handed her the stockings, she accepted them with murmured thanks. Now, Thomas said once they were back outside, I reckon you'll need a place to stay. The widow Holbrook runs a respectable boarding house just 2 streets over. She might know of work, too. Lillian stopped on the sidewalk, looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Why are you helping me, Marshal Zachary? You don't know anything about me. Thomas adjusted his hat, considering her question. Everyone deserves kindness, Mrs. Cooper, especially those starting fresh. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've got a sister who traveled alone after her husband died in the war. I'd hope someone would help her if she needed it. Something in his straightforward explanation made Lillian believe him. Thank you then, I won't forget your kindness. There's a social at the church this Saturday evening, he said suddenly. Whole town usually turns out, good way to meet folks who might need help with schooling or such. A social, Lillian repeated uncertainly. Dancing, food, conversation, Thomas clarified. Nothing fancy, but it's how we welcome newcomers proper. He hesitated, then added, I'd be honored if you'd save me a dance, Mrs. Cooper, to break in those new boots. Lillian felt an unexpected flutter in her chest, something she hadn't experienced since before Daniel fell ill. It was disconcerting after years of grief and struggle. I haven't danced in a very long time, she admitted. Then it's high time you started again. His blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. What do you say? Looking down at her new boots, then back up at the kind marshal, Lillian found herself nodding. One dance, Marshal Zachary, to properly thank you for the boots. I'll hold you to that, he said, tipping his hat again. Now let's get you settled at Mrs. Holbrook's. As they walked through Redemption Creek, Lillian felt the curious stares of townsfolk, but they seemed less hostile now that she walked alongside the marshal. Her new boots made a satisfying sound on the wooden sidewalks, solid and purposeful, unlike the desperate shuffle of before. For the first time since receiving news of Daniel's death, Lillian felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps Redemption Creek would indeed offer the fresh start she so desperately needed. Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house was a well-maintained 2-story building with a wide front porch adorned with rocking chairs and potted geraniums. The widow herself proved to be a plump, energetic woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Another widow, eh? She said after Thomas explained Lillian's situation. Lord knows we have enough of those out west. Rooms $5 a month includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers upstairs, no liquor on the premises. That sounds more than fair, Lillian said, relieved the price was within her means at least for a month or two until she found steady work. As it happens, Mrs. Holbrook continued, I was just saying to Reverend Phillips that we're in dire need of someone to help with the little ones during Sunday service. Previous girl up and married a cattle baron's son last month. Pays 50 cents a Sunday. I'd be happy to help, Lillian said quickly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Clara Wilkins at the dress shop mentioned needing someone with fine stitching skills, Thomas added. Her eyes aren't what they used to be. Mrs. Holbrook nodded approvingly. The Marshal's right. Clara pays fair wages for quality work. After completing the arrangements for her room, Thomas prepared to take his leave. I'll let you get settled, Mrs. Cooper. Church social starts at 7 on Saturday if you're still of a mind to attend. I haven't forgotten our arrangement, Marshal, Lillian said, finding herself smiling for what felt like the first time in years. One dance, as promised. He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Lillian to follow Mrs. Holbrook to her new quarters, a small but clean room with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the street. The Marshal doesn't usually escort newcomers to my door, Mrs. Holbrook remarked with raised eyebrows. Nor buy them boots from McAllister's. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. He was simply being kind. Thomas Zachary is a good man, the older woman agreed. Keeps to himself mostly since coming back from fighting Indians on the frontier. Been our Marshal 3 years now. She paused at the door. Just so you know, half the unmarried ladies in town have set their caps for him, with no success. With that intriguing piece of information, Mrs. Holbrook left Lillian alone. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Lillian removed her new boots, running her fingers over the smooth leather. They represented far more than footwear. They were a gesture of kindness when she'd expected only ridicule. The next day, Lillian visited Clara Wilkins's dress shop and secured work doing fine finishing work 3 afternoons a week. She also arranged to meet with Reverend Phillips about the Sunday school position. By the end of her first week in Redemption Creek, she had pieced together enough potential income to keep herself fed and housed, if not much more. Through it all, she found her thoughts returning to Marshal Zachary, his unexpected kindness, the quiet strength in his manner, and those startlingly blue eyes. Lillian told herself it was natural to think of someone who had shown such generosity to a stranger, nothing more. Yet each time she crossed paths with him on her errands around town, the same flutter returned to her chest. Saturday arrived before Lillian felt properly prepared. She owned only 2 dresses, neither suitable for a social occasion. Examining them critically in her room, she decided her navy blue wool would have to suffice with some alterations. Working quickly with needle and thread borrowed from Mrs. Holbrook, Lillian freshened the collar with a bit of white lace she'd carried in her sewing kit. She washed her honey-brown hair and arranged it in a simple but elegant style, securing it with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, one of the few keepsakes she hadn't been forced to sell. When she descended the stairs at 6:30, Mrs. Holbrook gave an approving nod. "You clean up nice, Mrs. Cooper. Those boots go well with that dress." "Thank you," Lillian replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. "I haven't attended a social gathering since before my husband passed." "Well, you remember how to dance." "I believe so," Lillian said, though in truth she wasn't certain. Daniel had never been one for dancing, even before his illness. Mrs. Holbrook patted her arm. "It'll come back to you, dear. Just follow the music and your partner's lead." They walked together to the church, where lanterns had been strung up in the yard and the meeting hall transformed with bunting and flowers. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and several men with fiddles, a guitar, and a harmonica were setting up in the corner. Mrs. Cooper. Thomas's voice came from behind her. "You made it." Lillian turned to find the Marshal looking quite transformed from his usual working attire. He wore a clean white shirt, dark waistcoat, and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and she noticed for the first time that it curled slightly at the temples. "Marshal Zachary," she greeted him, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and modest alterations. "Thomas, please," he corrected. "We're not much for formality at these gatherings." "Then you must call me Lillian," she replied, finding it easier than expected to slip into the familiar address. "Lillian," he repeated, as if trying out the sound of it. "It suits you." Mrs. Holbrook excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving them standing together as more townspeople arrived. Thomas introduced her to so many people that Lillian feared she would never remember all their names, but everyone was welcoming, if curious about the new widow in town. The music started with a lively reel, and couples quickly formed sets on the dance floor. Lillian watched, enjoying the colorful swirl of movement and the genuine pleasure on people's faces. "I believe I was promised one dance," Thomas said when the musicians paused between songs. "To break in those boots." Lillian glanced down at her feet. "They're already quite comfortable, but I'll honor our arrangement all the same." The next dance was a waltz, slower and more intimate than the reel. Thomas led her onto the floor and placed his hand respectfully at her waist. When they began to move, Lillian was surprised by how naturally they fell into step together. "You dance very well," she remarked. "My mother insisted all her children learn properly," he explained. "Said it was a civilized skill even frontier folks should maintain." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Thomas agreed, a momentary sadness crossing his features. "Lost her 2 winters ago to pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. "It's hard losing those we love." He nodded, guiding her through a turn. "How long has your husband been gone?" 3 years this past April," she answered. "Tuberculosis." They danced in silence for a few moments, sharing the unspoken understanding of grief. "You mentioned a sister," Lillian said eventually. "Is she nearby?" "Rebecca lives in Denver now with her second husband." "Good man, railroad engineer. They have 2 little ones I've yet to meet." "And the rest of your family?" "Father passed before the war. 2 brothers, one ranching in Montana, the other practicing law in St. Louis." His hand was warm and steady at her waist. "What about you? Any family back east?" Lillian shook her head. "My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt, but she passed several years ago. It was just Daniel and me." "No children?" he asked carefully. "We hoped, but it wasn't to be," she replied, the old sorrow a familiar ache. "Perhaps a blessing, given how things turned out." The music drew to a close, and Thomas reluctantly released her. "Thank you for the dance, Lillian." "Thank you for the boots that made it possible," she countered with a small smile. Before he could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A young man burst in, breathing hard. "Marshal, there's trouble at the Golden Nugget. Rogers and Madsen are at it again, guns drawn." Thomas's expression immediately shifted to one of professional concern. "Excuse me, Lillian. Duty calls." "Of course," she said, trying not to show her disappointment as he hurried away. Left alone, Lillian made her way to the refreshment table, where she was quickly engaged in conversation by several of the town's matrons. They were clearly curious about her connection to the marshal, but polite enough not to ask directly. "Thomas Zachary is a fine man," Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, remarked. "This town was lawless before he took the badge." "He seems very dedicated," Lillian agreed neutrally. "Never seen him escort a lady to Mrs. Holbrook's before," added Mrs. Jenkins, the banker's wife. "Or buy boots for one, for that matter." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. The marshal was simply being kind to a newcomer in distress. Mrs. Patterson hummed skeptically. "Thomas Zachary has turned down dinner invitations from every eligible lady in this town. Never shown particular interest in any of them." "Perhaps he's still grieving his late wife," Lillian suggested, suddenly curious whether the marshal had been married before. The women exchanged glances. "Thomas has never been married," Mrs. Jenkins informed her. "Came close once, they say, before he went off to fight Indians. Girl couldn't wait, married someone else while he was gone." This information gave Lillian pause. Why would a handsome, established man like Thomas remain unmarried in a territory where eligible men outnumbered women significantly? The social continued without the marshal's return. Lillian danced with Reverend Phillips, Mr. McAllister, and the young doctor who worked with Dr. Patterson, but found herself watching the door, hoping Thomas would reappear. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Mrs. Holbrook suggested they head home. Hiding her disappointment, Lillian agreed. They were collecting their shawls when the door opened and Thomas entered, looking somewhat disheveled but unharmed. "Everything all right, Marshal?" someone called. "Situation's handled," he replied. "Rogers and Madsen will sleep it off in the jail tonight." His eyes scanned the room until they found Lillian, and he made his way toward her. "I apologize for disappearing," he said when he reached her. "Part of wearing the badge." "No apology necessary," Lillian assured him. "I understand duty comes first. Still, I had hoped for more than one dance." His gaze held hers. "Perhaps another time, perhaps," she agreed, trying to ignore Mrs. Holbrook's interested expression beside her. "Allow me to walk you ladies home," Thomas offered. "It's getting late." The night air had cooled considerably, and Lillian was glad of her shawl as they walked through the quiet streets. Mrs. Holbrook, displaying remarkable tact, walked slightly ahead, giving them a measure of privacy. "Did you enjoy the social?" Thomas asked. "Very much," Lillian replied honestly. "Everyone has been welcoming." "This is a good town," he said. "Been through its rough patches like anywhere on the frontier, but folks look out for each other here." They reached the boarding house too quickly. Mrs. Holbrook discreetly went inside, leaving them alone on the porch. "Thank you again for the dance," Lillian said, suddenly shy. "And for everything else." Thomas studied her face in the gentle glow of the porch lantern. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper tomorrow evening. Mrs. Garcia at the cafe serves an excellent Sunday roast." The invitation took Lillian by surprise. "Supper, with you, unless you'd rather not," he added quickly. "I understand if it's too soon or no," Lillian interrupted. "I mean, yes, I would like that very much." His smile transformed his face, making him look younger and more carefree than she'd yet seen. "I'll call for you at 5 then." "I'll be ready," she promised. He tipped his hat and descended the porch steps. Lillian watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness, before entering the boarding house with a curious lightness in her heart. Sunday morning found Lillian at the church early, meeting with Reverend Phillips to discuss her duties with the children during services. The work was straightforward, keeping a dozen youngsters between 4 and 10 years old occupied with Bible stories and simple crafts while their parents attended worship. The children proved lively but manageable, and Lillian found herself enjoying their earnest questions and eager participation. When the service ended, several mothers approached to thank her, seeming relieved to have found a suitable replacement for their previous teacher. Throughout the morning, Lillian was conscious of Thomas sitting near the front of the church, his tall frame unmistakable even from a distance. Once their eyes met briefly across the room, and the small smile he gave her caused that now familiar flutter to return. After services, Lillian returned to Mrs. Holbrook's to prepare for her supper engagement. She took special care with her appearance, wondering at her own eagerness. It had been so long since she'd felt this particular kind of anticipation, not since the early days with Daniel, before hardship and illness had worn away the tenderness between them. At precisely 5 o'clock, a knock came at the front door. Lillian descended the stairs to find Thomas waiting in the parlor, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and his good waistcoat. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, noting how his compliment lacked the practiced smoothness some men affected. There was a directness to Thomas Zachary that Lillian found refreshing. Mrs. Garcia's cafe was a small but cheerful establishment on Main Street, offering a blend of traditional American fare and dishes reflecting the proprietress's Mexican heritage. The delicious aromas of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air as they entered. A plump, dark-haired woman in her 40s greeted them warmly. "Marshal, and the new lady in town, I save good table for you." She led them to a corner table covered with a checked cloth and adorned with a small vase of wildflowers. After taking their order, she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them alone. "I hope you like hearty food," Thomas said. "Elena doesn't believe in small portions." "After boarding house meals, anything homemade will be wonderful," Lillian assured him. "Mrs. Holbrook's cooking isn't to your liking?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. Lillian laughed softly. "Let's just say she believes boiling is the answer to preparing any vegetable." Their conversation flowed easily as they discussed the town, its history, and the people Lillian had met. Thomas had a dry wit she hadn't fully appreciated before, and she found herself laughing more than she had in years. When Mrs. Garcia brought their food generous portions of succulent roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables, they continued talking between bites. Thomas told her about his time as a cavalry officer on the frontier, though he glossed over the specifics of combat. "It wasn't what I expected," he admitted. "The army paints a glorious picture of bringing civilization to the wilderness, but the reality is more complicated." "How so?" Lillian asked, genuinely interested. Thomas considered his words carefully. "The Indians we fought weren't savages, as they're often portrayed. They were people defending their homes and way of life. Made me question a lot of what I thought I knew." "Is that why you became a marshal instead of staying in the army?" He nodded. "Wanted to protect people without having to fight wars I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. When Redemption Creek needed a new lawman, it seemed like the right fit." "And has it been?" Lillian asked. "Most days," Thomas replied with a small smile. "Though breaking up fights between drunken cowboys wasn't exactly what I envisioned for my life." Lillian laughed. "Few of us end up where we expect, I suppose." "What about you?" he asked. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" "Since I was a girl," she confirmed. "I loved learning and wanted to share that with others. When I married Daniel, I gave it up because he wanted a traditional wife who stayed home." "Do you regret that?" Thomas's question was gentle but direct. Lillian paused, considering her answer. "I regret losing myself in trying to be what someone else wanted," she said finally. "Daniel wasn't a bad man, but he had very fixed ideas about a woman's place." "And what do you think a woman's place is?" Thomas asked, watching her closely. "Wherever she can be of use and find fulfillment," Lillian replied without hesitation. "Whether that's teaching children, running a household, or something else entirely." A look of approval crossed Thomas's face. "My mother would have liked you. She taught all 4 of us children to cook, clean, and mend, said no man should be helpless if left on his own." "She sounds wonderful," Lillian said, smiling at the thought of a young Thomas learning to sew. "She was," he agreed, a fond expression softening his features. "Strongest person I've ever known." By the time they finished their apple pie and coffee, the cafe had emptied of other patrons. Mrs. Garcia shooed them out good-naturedly, insisting the marshal didn't need to pay but accepting his money all the same. The evening air was pleasant as they walked back toward the boarding house, neither seeming in a hurry to end their time together. Stars sparkled overhead in a vast canopy, and the sounds of piano music drifted from the saloon down the street. "I enjoyed this evening," Lillian said as they reached Mrs. Holbrook's porch. "Thank you." "As did I," Thomas replied. He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to see you again, Lillian, not just in passing around town." Her heart quickened at his directness. "I'd like that too." In the gentle glow of the porch lamp, Thomas's blue eyes seemed deeper, more intense. He stepped closer, and for a moment Lillian thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it briefly. "Good night, Lillian Cooper," he said softly. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, reluctant to go inside despite Mrs. Holbrook's rules about late returns. He waited until she was safely inside before departing, and Lillian watched through the front window as he walked away, his stride purposeful even after a long day. The following weeks established a pattern to Lillian's new life in Redemption Creek. She taught the children during Sunday services, worked at Clara Wilkins's dress shop 3 afternoons a week, and took an additional sewing to supplement her income. Word of her fine stitching spread quickly, bringing steady work from the town's more prosperous ladies. Thomas became a regular presence in her life. They shared supper at Mrs. Garcia's cafe every Sunday evening. On Wednesdays, if his duties allowed, he would escort her home from the dress shop, and they would walk along the creek that gave the town its name. Occasionally, he brought her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, fresh cookies from the bakery, or wildflowers gathered during his rounds. With each meeting, Lillian found herself more drawn to the thoughtful Marshal. His quiet strength and unwavering integrity appealed to her in ways Daniel's passionate but unreliable nature never had. Thomas was a man who kept his word and considered his actions, carefully traits Lillian had come to value after years of broken promises and hasty decisions. As summer progressed into early autumn, their relationship deepened. The town noticed, of course. Lillian became aware of speculative glances and hushed conversations that ceased when she approached. Most seemed approving of the connection between the respected Marshal and the hard-working widow, though some of the unmarried ladies viewed her with undisguised envy. One crisp September evening, Thomas invited Lillian to accompany him on a ride to witness the sunset from Lookout Ridge, a scenic spot overlooking the valley. Mrs. Holbrook, acting as unofficial chaperone, gave her blessing with a knowing smile. "Just be back before full dark," she instructed. "I may be old-fashioned, but reputations matter in a small town." Thomas arrived promptly at 4 o'clock with 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable. He helped Lillian mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. They rode at an easy pace through town and out onto the open plain, where tall grasses waved in the breeze. The air carried the scent of sage and the first hints of autumn coolness. Lillian found a freedom in riding she hadn't experienced in years, and laughed with pure joy as they cantered across a stretch of flat ground. "You ride well," Thomas observed when they slowed again. "Better than most Eastern ladies I've known. My father taught me before he died," Lillian explained. "Daniel didn't approve of women riding astride, so I hadn't been on a horse in nearly 10 years until today." Thomas frowned slightly. "Seems a shame to give up something you clearly enjoy." "Many things seem that way in hindsight," she replied. "When you're in the midst of it, you make compromises without realizing how much you're surrendering." They reached Lookout Ridge as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains. Thomas helped Lillian dismount and secured the horses before leading her to a flat rock overlooking the spectacular view. The valley spread before them, golden in the late afternoon light, with Redemption Creek visible as a thin silver ribbon winding through the landscape. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, taking in the panorama. "This is my favorite place," Thomas admitted, standing close beside her. "I come here to think when decisions weigh heavy." "And what decisions bring you here lately?" she asked, sensing there was something specific on his mind. Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "Lillian, I've been considering something important. These past months getting to know you, they've been the happiest I can remember." Her heart began to race, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I know it hasn't been long and perhaps I should wait, but..." He took a deep breath. "I find myself thinking about you constantly, your strength, your kindness, your determination, the way you rebuilt your life here, earning respect through hard work." "Thomas." Lillian began, but he gently placed a finger against her lips. "Let me finish, or I might lose my courage," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I never expected to feel this way again, or perhaps at all. After Rebecca's husband died, I saw how grief nearly destroyed her. Then when Sarah chose another while I was away fighting, I decided maybe solitude was my path." He took her hands in his. "Until you stumbled into town with those torn shoes, looking both vulnerable and defiant all at once." Lillian's eyes filled with tears at the memory and the tenderness in his voice. "I'm not a wealthy man," Thomas continued. "Being Marshal doesn't pay handsomely, but I own a small house at the edge of town with good land around it. It's simple but sound, with room for a garden, maybe some chickens. Room to grow if you wanted that." He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Lillian Cooper, I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not to replace what you lost, but to build something new together." Stunned by the unexpected proposal, Lillian struggled to find her voice. "Thomas, we've known each other barely 3 months. Some people know in 3 minutes, he countered. Others never know at all. I'm certain of what I feel, Lillian, but if you need time to consider, I understand." Lillian looked into his earnest blue eyes and realized she didn't need time at all. The answer was clear in her heart. "Yes," she said softly, then more confidently. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he rose and pulled her gently into his arms. Their first kiss was tender and questioning, quickly deepening into something more certain as Lillian responded to his touch. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to be a good husband to you, Lillian. To respect your thoughts and wishes, to support your dreams alongside mine. And I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes," she replied, thinking how different this felt from her hasty marriage to Daniel at 19. This was a choice made with mature understanding, not youthful impetuosity. They watched the sunset together, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. The brilliant oranges and purples painting the sky seemed to herald a bright beginning rather than merely day's end. As twilight gathered, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey. Riding side by side under the emerging stars, they discussed practical matters: when they would marry, where they would live, how to combine their separate lives. "My house needs a woman's touch," Thomas admitted. "It's functional but hardly a home." "I don't have much to bring," Lillian said, "just some clothes, books, and my sewing things." "We'll build our home together," he assured her, "starting with the essentials and adding as we go." When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Holbrook was waiting on the porch, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern at their slightly late return. "Mrs. Holbrook," Thomas called before dismounting, "I hope you'll forgive our tardiness, but we have news to share." The older woman's face broke into a knowing smile. "Well, it's about time, Marshal. I was beginning to think you'd never work up the courage to ask her." Lillian laughed in surprise. "Was it that obvious?" "To everyone but the two of you, dear," Mrs. Holbrook replied. "Now come inside and tell me all about it while the Marshal returns those horses." News of their engagement spread through Redemption Creek with remarkable speed. By noon the following day, Lillian had received congratulations from nearly everyone she encountered. Clara Wilkins insisted on making her a wedding dress as a gift, and Reverend Phillips offered the church for the ceremony whenever they chose to hold it. They decided on a simple wedding in late October, giving them time to prepare Thomas's house and for Lillian to complete her outstanding sewing commissions. In the evenings, Thomas would escort her to his property at the edge of town, where they worked together to transform the bachelor residence into a home for two. The house was indeed functional, as Thomas had described: a solidly built two-bedroom structure with a spacious kitchen, comfortable parlor, and wraparound porch. What it lacked was the feminine touches that would make it truly inviting. Lillian sewed curtains from fabric Thomas purchased in McAllister's store, arranged furniture to create conversational groupings rather than the utilitarian layout he'd maintained, and added small decorative elements like wildflowers in mason jars and colorful braided rugs she made from fabric scraps. "I hardly recognize the place," Thomas remarked one evening as they sat on the porch swing he had installed at her request. "It feels like a real home now." "It will be," Lillian said, leaning against his shoulder, "our home." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with aspen trees around the town displaying their golden autumn foliage. In her room at Mrs. Holbrook's, Lillian prepared with the help of several ladies who had become friends during her months in Redemption Creek. Clara Wilkins had outdone herself with the wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim that made Lillian feel more beautiful than she had in years. Mrs. Patterson arranged her hair with small white flowers, while Mrs. Jenkins lent her a pair of pearl earrings as something borrowed. "Every bride needs new shoes," Mrs. Holbrook declared, presenting Lillian with a pair of delicate ivory satin slippers for the ceremony. "Though I suspect you'll always keep those boots the Marshal bought you." "Always," Lillian confirmed, touching the well-worn leather boots that had come to symbolize her fresh start. They were the first step on this new path. The church was filled to capacity when Lillian walked down the aisle alone, her bouquet of autumn wildflowers trembling slightly in her hands. Thomas waited at the altar, looking handsome and somewhat awestruck in his best suit, his eyes never leaving her as she approached. Reverend Phillips conducted a simple but meaningful ceremony, speaking of partnership, respect, and love that grows stronger through shared challenges. When it came time to exchange vows, Thomas's voice was steady and sure, while Lillian's trembled with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared to the assembled congregation. "Marshal Zachary, you may kiss your bride." Thomas drew her gently into his arms, his kiss tender but unmistakably possessive. The church erupted in applause and cheers as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as a married couple. The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes contributed by the community. Mrs. Garcia had prepared a special wedding cake decorated with crystallized flowers, and someone had brought fiddles and a guitar for dancing. As afternoon turned to evening, Thomas led Lillian onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. As they moved together to the gentle waltz, Lillian was reminded of that first dance months ago when her new boots had clicked against the wooden floor. "Happy?" Thomas asked softly, his hand warm at her waist. "Completely," she assured him, realizing it was true. The grief and struggle of recent years hadn't disappeared, but they had been balanced by new joy and hope. Later, as they prepared to leave the celebration, Lillian changed from her satin slippers back into her sturdy boots practical for the walk to their home. Thomas noticed and smiled. "Those boots have served you well," he observed. "As has the man who gave them to me," she replied, taking his arm. They walked home through the quiet streets of Redemption Creek, greeted by well-wishers along the way. Their house now, was lit with lanterns Thomas had arranged before the ceremony, creating a warm welcome. At the front door, Thomas surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a grin, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, Lillian was surprised to discover new touches she hadn't seen during their preparations, a colorful quilt on their bed that she recognized as Mrs. Holbrook's handiwork, a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table, and a small framed photograph of her parents that she'd mentioned losing during her difficult journey west. "How did you?" she began, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. "You described it so clearly once," Thomas explained. "I wrote to a photographer in St. Louis who specializes in restoring and copying old images. Sent him your description and the approximate year. He found something similar in his archives and altered it to match what you remembered." Tears filled Lillian's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "Thomas, this means more than I can express. I wanted you to have a piece of your past here," he said simply, "as we build our future." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other in new ways, gentle at first, then with increasing passion as initial shyness gave way to deeper intimacy. Lillian found in Thomas a considerate lover who put her comfort and pleasure before his own, a sharp contrast to her previous experience of marriage. In the quiet aftermath, lying in his arms as moonlight filtered through the new curtains, Lillian felt a sense of homecoming that transcended physical place. They talked softly of hopes and dreams, children they might have, improvements to the house and land, ways they could contribute to their community together. "I never expected this," Lillian admitted, tracing the contours of his face with her fingertips. "When I arrived in Redemption Creek, I was just hoping to survive." "And now," Thomas asked, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Now I'm hoping to thrive," she replied. "With you." The weeks and months that followed established patterns and rhythms to their shared life. Thomas continued his duties as marshal, while Lillian balanced her sewing work with creating a comfortable home. They planted a garden that autumn for spring vegetables, acquired 6 chickens that provided fresh eggs, and began discussing the possibility of purchasing additional land for a small orchard. Christmas brought their first major celebration as a married couple. They decorated their home with pine boughs and red ribbons, hosting dinner for friends who had become like family. Thomas surprised Lillian with a fine sewing machine ordered from a catalog months earlier, while she presented him with a hand-tooled leather gun belt she had secretly commissioned from the town's saddler. Winter passed with cozy evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply enjoying comfortable silence as Lillian sewed, and Thomas whittled a hobby he had recently taken up. Their physical relationship deepened with familiarity, each discovering the other's preferences and desires in the privacy of their bedroom. When spring arrived, bringing wildflowers and warmer days, Lillian shared news that brought Thomas to his knees beside her chair in gratitude and wonder they would welcome a child before the year's end. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion as he placed a tentative hand on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday," she replied, covering his hand with her own. "He says everything appears healthy. The baby should arrive in late November." Thomas gathered her into his arms, his joy evident in the way he held her as if she were precious beyond measure. "I never thought. That is, I hoped but didn't dare expect." "I know," Lillian said, understanding all he couldn't articulate. At 36, Thomas had resigned himself to remaining childless. At 28, after years of disappointment with Daniel, Lillian had done the same. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer and autumn months. Thomas became increasingly protective, insisting on handling the heavier household tasks and hiring young Billy Carter to help with the garden and chickens. Lillian reduced her sewing commissions but continued teaching Sunday school, finding joy in the children's excitement about her impending motherhood. On a snowy evening in late November, after a relatively easy labor attended by Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Holbrook, Lillian gave birth to a healthy daughter with her father's striking blue eyes and a dusting of her mother's honey-brown hair. "She's perfect," Thomas whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with careful hands that seemed enormous against her tiny form. "What shall we name her?" Lillian watched her husband and daughter together, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "What about Hope? It seems fitting." "Hope Zachary," Thomas tested the name, smiling down at the sleeping child. "It's perfect, like her mother." As winter settled over Redemption Creek, the small family established new routines around the baby's needs. Thomas often walked the floor with Hope in the night, allowing Lillian to rest, singing old cavalry songs in a gentle voice that never failed to soothe their daughter. On Christmas Eve, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Thomas and Lillian sat together before the fire, reflecting on the extraordinary changes in their lives over the past year. "It's hard to believe that 18 months ago I arrived here with nothing but torn shoes and fading hope," Lillian mused, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "And now," Thomas asked, stroking her hair. "Now I have everything I never dared dream of," she replied simply. "A loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a true home, security, purpose, joy." Thomas tightened his arm around her shoulders. "All from a pair of boots and a dance." "No," Lillian corrected, turning to meet his gaze. "All from the kindness of a good man who saw value in a widow others mocked. Who offered dignity instead of charity, respect instead of pity." "I saw courage," Thomas said softly, "and strength, and a woman I couldn't bear to let walk away." As the fire crackled and their daughter slept peacefully nearby, Lillian realized that Redemption Creek had lived up to its name. Here she had found not just a fresh start, but genuine redemption, the transformation of loss and suffering into new life and joy. "I love you, Thomas Zachary," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of all they had built together. "And I love you, Lillian Zachary," he replied, sealing the declaration with a kiss that promised many more years of shared happiness to come. 5 years later, on a warm June afternoon, Lillian stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Thomas taught their daughter Hope to ride her new pony in the paddock they had built. Beside them, 3-year-old Samuel toddled after his sister, determined to keep up despite his short legs. The house behind her had grown along with their family, a second story added 2 years earlier, the kitchen expanded, and a proper study created for Thomas, who had recently been elected mayor of Redemption Creek after hanging up his marshal's badge. Lillian's hand rested on her rounded belly, where their third child grew steadily. Dr. Patterson predicted another month before this new addition would join their family. So much had changed since that dusty day when she'd stumbled on the sidewalk, her torn shoes exposing her poverty and vulnerability to a town of strangers. The woman she had been then proud despite her circumstances, determined yet fearful, would hardly recognize the confident, contented person she had become. She thought of those boots sometimes, though they had long since been replaced with newer pairs. Thomas had insisted she keep them, and they rested in a trunk in their bedroom, a tangible reminder of beginnings. "Mama, look," Hope called, sitting straight and proud on her pony as Thomas led them in a circle. "I'm riding by myself. I see you, sweetheart." Lillian called back, smiling at her daughter's achievement and her husband's patient instruction. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Lillian and Thomas sat together on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they enjoyed a moment of peaceful companionship. "I received a letter from Rebecca today," Thomas mentioned. "She and Edward are planning to visit next month with the children. They want to see the new baby." "That's wonderful," Lillian said, pleased at the thought of seeing her sister-in-law again. "The children will be excited to meet their cousins." Thomas nodded, his hand absently stroking her arm. "I was thinking about something today watching Hope with that pony." "What's that?" Lillian asked, hearing something significant in his tone. "About how life gives us second chances in unexpected ways," he said thoughtfully. "When I came back from the frontier, I thought I'd missed my opportunity for this kind of life, a family, children, true partnership." Lillian understood completely. "I felt the same after Daniel died, like I'd failed at the one chance I had. And now look at us," Thomas marveled, his hand moving to rest atop hers on her belly, where their child shifted beneath their touch. "All because you walked into town that day." "All because you noticed a widow with torn shoes," Lillian corrected gently, "and offered not just boots but dignity and a dance." Thomas smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to dance. Even better than asking me to marry you," she teased. "That was just the natural next step," he replied with certainty. "I think I knew from that first dance that you were the one I'd been waiting for." As twilight deepened into night, they remained together on the porch, planning their future, reminiscing about their past, and savoring their present happiness, a family built on kindness, respect, and love that had begun with a simple pair of boots and the courage to step forward into a new dance.